There was an abandoned house near my grandparents' home. It was a large, 2-story home set on a large block with what used to be an enormous rose garden. It also had the oldest tree in town, a landmark if you will, one with a grim history now. It would have been a sight to behold when it had been maintained. The driveway and front lawn were completely overgrown with weeds. A collection of old, yellow newspapers sat near the front door, piled high. The curtains were stained in what looked to be over 10 years' worth of dust. Long and winding vines coated the walls thickly. The rusted gates were chained to forbid entry, and I'm not sure when the last time they were open was. Probably when 2 local boys went missing, and they were never found. We were always warned not to go near that old house. There were many stories, often conflicting about why the house had been abandoned, and why no one had tried to buy the home. Besides the obvious expense it would take to repair and maintain it. Whenever people would ask about the place, the townspeople would get all quiet. Hushed voices, sideward glances. They would try to avoid the question, and when I discovered the reason, I understood why. However, the teenagers of the community were much more vocal about it. They explained to me the most popular version of the story of what happened. In 1960, there was a happy family that lived there. Pretty standard for the time. Mum, Dad, 3 kids, and some versions say there was a grandmother living there at the time too, but we're not going to include that version. The father was a wealthy businessman, well respected within the community, and the mother was beloved by all. Sure, the small town wasn't much, but if the town had aristocrats, they were it. No business would open without this family present for the party. Every wedding or social event, they were invited. Their children were overachievers, straight-A students, well-mannered, and the kids that parents would often despair when they compared their own failing children to. The type of kids who parents adored having in their class. Every sports team wanted them. Every school group loved them. They were all the town darlings. I think you understand where I'm going with this. So, why would such a perfect family be torn apart? There was a carnival, an annual event to celebrate the founding of the town, or so I think. The true meaning has long been lost, and instead it has become part of the consumer fantasy. People would purchase handmade items, antiques, and I think it is called a flea market or trash and treasure, depending on where you're from. There would be contests with different kinds of food, an incredibly competitive cake baking contest that caused the most friction in the small community. Again, it is a lot more commercial these days, it's lost a lot of the charm. But back then, it was supposed to be so damn good. The family found a small vendor who sold a variety of trinkets. Handmade necklaces, brooches, and bracelets. It was also said that they had a variety of sacred symbols from different cultures. Now, this was the 60s, so people weren't as PC about these sorts of things. The little girl chose what she thought was just a pretty bracelet that she would be able to wear. It looked silver, with a cheap, almost gaudy red stone, set in the middle, surrounded by several shapes. Soon it was purchased and the girl slipped it on her tiny wrist to take it home. the perfect family continued their trip. They got fairy floss or cotton candy and spoke to the rest of the townspeople. Everyone was eager to be close to them. However, no one noticed that the red stone had begun to glow, nor that the vendor had mysteriously disappeared. When they got home, they had dinner, meat and 3 veg, and otherwise had an uneventful evening. After the daughter had her bath, she got dressed for bed and went to take the bracelet off. It wouldn't come off. She pulled and struggled with it for a while to try to pull it away. Nothing worked. Eventually, the normally determined child gave up and curled up to sleep. While she slept, the normally happy and peaceful dreams were replaced with screams, burning flames, and hundreds of hands reaching up to try to pull her down with them. In the morning and at the breakfast table, she told her parents what happened. This did not sound like anything their little girl had spoken about before. The mother and father looked at each other, and then did their best to comfort her, telling her it was just a dream and perhaps she'd been watching too much television. No doubt it was encouraging her to think wicked thoughts, and they decided to restrict how much TV the family watched. She did not like the answers, and went to school where she did not perform as well as she usually does. The teacher noticed the normally bright pupil was distant and did not engage with the material like she usually did. In fact, she turned away when classwork was presented to her, and even had the ill manner to swear at the teacher. Confused, the teacher decided to keep the little girl in after class. Apparently, my grandmother's hairdresser's niece's boyfriend's sister walked past the classroom that day and looked in. She had to hand in some notes or something. The little girl sat in the middle of the classroom at her desk, completely silent. She couldn't see her face. However, the teacher looked frightened and leaned back against her desk. She pointed her finger at the girl. Something felt terribly off. The sister knocked, and whatever happened seemed to come to an end. The teacher went back to normal, except for her hand resting on her chest, gasping for air and breathless. A look of tremendous fright still in her eyes. The little girl said in a clear tone, "May I be excused?" And the teacher agreed. Far too quickly. When the little girl walked past her, the friend felt a chill go up her spine, and she noticed the little girl held the bracelet tight in her small hands. So, I imagine even now you're questioning it. Children, even well-behaved ones, do not always behave themselves. And admittedly, that little snippet isn't the most reliable from what I've heard. How about I give you the cold, hard facts of what happened that changed that house? The little girl's behavior gradually began to get even worse. She became violent. At least, not at first. Not outwardly where she would lash out at people or hurt them. Oh no. She would manipulate other people into doing her dirty work for her. Instead of potentially bringing shame to the family, they covered it up to avoid any shame or change to their picture-perfect image. There was one night when screaming was heard by the neighbors. Frantic and blood-curdling screams at 3 a.m. Naturally, this was strange for a town that had not had many, if any, murders or any other forms of crime. The police were called. The father answered the door calmly and invited the officers inside for a cup of tea. Everything felt strange. Yet there were no signs of intruders, nor any damage done to the rest of the family. The officers had a look around, but nothing. Since there did not appear to be an issue, the police left the home and talked on the way back about how strange it was. The next day was Sunday. The dad was mowing the lawn while the mum brought out a nice, cool lemonade for him to drink. Each of them were dressed perfectly. The only sign that there may have been an issue were the exhaustion in their eyes. Keeping up appearances was much more important those days. The eldest son of the family was a pinnacle of high school success. Handsome, on the football team, good grades, and naturally incredibly popular with his peers. He had the reputation of being a good lover even. He would one day inherit the family business, but had excellent prospects for college. Now, how did he suffer? Well, it was gradual for him. He started losing his hair due to the stress at home. It is rumored that he managed to get an STD of some kind. Now education wasn't the best back then concerning treatment. Slowly, he began to lose his friends and social circle. Thus, his grades began to suffer. The stress of dealing with his sister's rages back home had reached boiling point. It eventually, and this isn't spoken about much, even these days, and it is always discussed in whispers. You know that old tree I mentioned before? The one out the back of the house? The one that everyone says is the oldest in town? He was found hanging from it. The family grieved, and it seemed only a short while ago their lives were perfect. Now, the middle child. Having been in the shadow of the perfect eldest child and then the adored youngest, you could say he suffered from a little middle child syndrome to begin with. The middle child tried to run away from home, refusing to stay anywhere near his little sister. So this was harder for the parents to conceal from the community. Their public image was now tarnished. The little girl, the youngest child, she was oddly quiet during this whole time. She never smiled again. Except at her eldest brother's funeral. Eventually, the middle child had begun to have violent outbursts, and a new treatment was offered, one that could protect the family's image and hopefully restore them in the public eye. It is viewed with shame now, but they had their middle son lobotomized and institutionalized. Now, back in those days, it would have been good to have a son to carry on the family name and continue the bloodline, but they had to, quote-unquote, make do. Now the parents had to deal with the ill-mannered youngest child, the limbo state of torture for their middle son, and mourn the loss of their eldest son. Both of the perfect parents were understandably beginning to crack under the pressure, and their marriage wasn't turning out so well. Understandably. The pair of them began to drink to excess to block out the pain. And eventually, well, they just stopped caring, you know. The house began to fall into disrepair. The mum stopped taking care of herself, and at one time, no party nor event was complete without them there. Now, everyone avoided having them there. If they saw them at the grocery store, they would walk in the opposite direction or talk behind their hands. It must have been lonely for them to have to deal with it on their own. Some of their close friends did, however, reach out and try, but they were always pushed away. Always. Eventually, all three of them stopped leaving the house altogether. It was grim. Cobwebs coated the walls. Plants grew wildly. Old newspapers practically created a second fort. And finally, the husband, the father, had a stroke that impacted half of his face and speech. He lost his job, friends, everything. Later he became a recluse in the garden shed, never leaving, doing his business outside and chasing the locals away from his lawn and property. He became a mockery, and my grandparents sadly admit that they joined in on it. They were part of it as well. As for the wife, husband and wife rarely spoke to each other. They were so absorbed in their own pain that they forgot about the other one. The wife died in her chair. Since the husband was no longer speaking to her regularly, her corpse was left to rot. The mangled, twisted corpse rested, a feast for the vermin, and it was many months before the police came to deal with the body. The husband was investigated, no charges brought against him, and there was talk about taking him into care. The family became a warning to everyone. Look what happened if you didn't keep up with your career, or have well-mannered children. People always love when their idols fall. A gunshot. The father shot himself. Blood and gore all over the wooden walls and coated the garden tools. The youngest daughter found him and stood there waiting. People saw her from the road. It is said she didn't blink, didn't move, and simply stood in her father's blood. When the authorities came to deal with the body and take her away, she was gone. Simply vanished without a trace. Years later, the search for her continued, and the worst part is there were sightings of her. It gave people hope, perhaps fueled by guilt or a false hope that maybe they too would be redeemed. Extensive searches began near the home, the local woodland, and anywhere else. She could not be found. Yet the sightings continued. As the people of the town grew older and eventually were replaced by the next generation, the little girl remained the same, and the house fell into further disrepair. The bracelet she wore is frequently seen around town, occasionally left on a picnic table or perhaps at the school. Every so often people can see her around town again. She has become an omen of doom, of family breakdown, and the failure of the community to protect its citizens. I saw her yesterday, and I woke up wearing her bracelet. I can't take it off. I hope you enjoyed this story, my little spooklings. Every now and then I'll be writing and narrating standalone stories like this one. Feel free to tell me what you think in the comment section down below. Now, don't forget to stab or gently caress the like button. Comment and subscribe if you haven't already. Check out my links below for merch and my Patreon. Stay safe, my little spooklings. And remember, I'll be watching you.